Palestinians then view themselves as engaged in righteous struggle to overcome the fitna posed by Israeli occupation and establishing their sovereignty and independence. Again, what Isaac does, he accuses evangelical Christians to do that, but he never critiques the Palestinians. And this is why the oppressor model is so problematic and advances evil. And the Muslim students, they know what's going on, or at least the people who are organizing this. Hi, my name is Timor, and I want to talk to you today about a gentleman. He's a Christian theologian and scholar located in Palestine. His name is Munther Isaac, and he is very much a critic of American evangelicals and their involvement in Israel and what they believe about Israel. One of the things that he's specifically critical about is that typically American evangelicals believe that that Israel has a special place in God's plan, and they go and they refer to that, for instance, in Romans 9, 10, and 11. Now, the way I'm going to critique Isaac is this. I think the problem in his critique lies in the fact that he incorporates, maybe unknowingly, parts of an Islamic worldview into his critique. I would say that the sermon he preached that I watched, it was called Christ at the Checkpoint Conference, is that same sermon could have been preached by the local imam in Palestine. And another critique I have is that he engages in Palestinian Liberation Theology, which uses Marxism as a lens to inform their theology, okay? So I want to, ideas have consequences. And so I want to unpack this to see what are the consequences. Isaac is really committed to a social justice, which is good. But the problem lies what informs the view of social justice. And so that is really where it is. Now, what he does first, he really believes that one of the main problems is colonialism. And so he lays the blame of what's going on in Palestine to colonialism. And there's a lot of factors there. Sort of the European colonial powers, they have, in the past, have created real problems today. And so it points back to colonialism. So what you need to do is decolonize the area, and Israel would be inheritors of some of those colonialist ideas, and so that looks at the problem. And so I believe, now when you understand Islam and how it was advanced after the death of Muhammad, it done so in a way that are pretty colonialist, to use that word, in and of themselves. And those ideas have systemic weight and are still informing much of the idea now. So if you don't even critique that, you are missing a lot of the problem. Now, if you're typically a Muslim, this is kind of your worldview, okay? So what he needs to do, in my opinion, is look outside of that and critique it for what it really is. But he's borrowing a lot of ideas that I'm sure he grew up in. He grows up in Palestine. He lives there all his life. And so he's been educated there and so on. And I don't think he's really engaged with the ideas that he was brought up with, because he seems to have a lot of the ideologies that is typical of someone that comes from Palestine, and he hasn't really engaged with that. So he still has that lens that he looks through, in my opinion. And so the problem, according to Isaac, is that evangelicals don't hold Israel accountable because they see Israel playing a special place in God's plan, and they can do no wrong. Okay? Now that is a problem. I think when there's wrong done, nations should be held accountable for that. I think there's an aspect there that is a valid critique. Okay? Evangelicals tend to have this idealistic idea of Israel. However, to say that Israel is the problem here, I think is gravely mistaken. And that is a highly problematic idea here. What we see here, the next point, is American evangelicals employ an empire theology. This is where power and domination take precedence over principles of justice and compassion. Notice that you categorize everything in an oppressed and oppressor format. And so evangelicals are the oppressors, the other are the oppressed. And so they're exercising power and domination. If that's true, what do? You return that with power and domination. And so what he says is that they take the pursuit of power and domination, and they don't look at justice and compassion. Now, I do want to say this. That can be a valid critique, okay? Because those who politicize their faith can use their faith for power and domination, okay? So that's a valid critique as an idea. So what you have to do, though, is you have to examine it and say, okay, is that what's going on there? Are they instead of showing compassion and seeking justice for Palestine, are they doing the opposite? So, but I think misunderstands the situation. He says that because evangelicals have a significant influence on American support for American policies and actions that marginalize oppressed Palestinians, then that hurts the Palestinian cause. Some of the idea. But again here, this is important to understand. He never holds Palestinians accountable. He never holds some of the problems in the Arab world accountable. It's only evangelicals. Here goes to the Marxist ideology of oppressed and oppressor. Okay? So those who are in the oppressed group, they're simply victims of the oppressor, and they take no responsibility in that. And so obviously that is problematic. Next, he believes that American evangelicals helped create ethnic cleansing in 1948. And he uses the Arabic word Nakba when speaking in English, and every Arab, when they hear Nakba, is referring to Israel, and that means catastrophe. Now, what exactly is the catastrophe? It's used by Muslims around the world to refer to the creation of the nation of Israel, and they look at that as a catastrophic event. And so for him and the Arab world this was a significant moment of injustice and displacement, particularly of the Palestinian people. So that's another idea. Okay, let me continue. He also believes that American evangelicals employ inequality and hypocrisy. Now, what he does here is his concerns regarding inequality and hypocrisy are sort of within this Palestinian and Israeli conflict. And in doing so, what he does, he points out the perceived contradiction between the professed values of evangelicals and the values like human rights and democracy and so on, and their unwavering support for Israeli policies. Now again, this can be a legitimate criticism, but what you find out when you look at these supposed violations, let me give you an example from some of these human rights organizations and so on. And so what you see there is really a biased account of these so-called violations, okay? So what I'm referring to primarily is the UN. I mean, let me give you an example. The UN has people who chair something like women's rights, like the leader of, or a leader from the delegation from Iran. You know, Iran is terrible with women's rights. And so this is sort of an example there. Sometimes there are sort of biased evaluations. Now, the next thing he does, he says they fail to employ solidarity with the oppressed, okay? Now, when you talk about solidarity, God cares about the oppressed, okay? Particularly in the Old Testament. He talks about that we should defend the widow, defend the orphan, defend the poor, and so on. So there is very much a call to do this, okay? But the problem is when you put solidarity with the oppressed and look at the situation solely as a loss of our differentiation of power and not holding people's actions morally accountable, since they're in the oppressed class, I must employ solidarity with them irregardless of what they do, okay? And that's why you see right now on our college campuses people who are at one hand saying we hold solidarity with the oppressed, and on the other hand destroying property and exerting violence and so on. And so I think that is something to look at now. And what he does is that he says, you know what, this doesn't really embody Christian teaching, okay? Now, this is my response to Munther Isaac. In response to accusations of genocide against Palestinians, he contends that biblical principles are manipulated to perpetuate these accusations. Now, he criticizes Western powers for providing theological support for Israel's actions, while at the same time condemning what he sees as America's racism, America's capitalism, America's totalitarianism. Now, his views are very much shaped by what's called Palestinian Liberation Theology. Now, if you remember way back in the election back in the 90s, Barack Obama there was this pastor that was made public about his views, and he engaged what they call black liberation theology. Here, this is Palestinian liberation theology. There's a theology called liberation theology, and what you do is you apply that to whatever problems you're seeking to address. And these are specific problems that are Palestinian, okay? So he very much rebukes the evangelicals. And, he advocates a resistance against Israeli occupation and sees this, obviously, as an oppressive regime. But the problem is, by emphasizing narratives of Palestinian resistance and national liberation in biblical contexts, what this does, this theology may strengthen Palestinian nationalism and a collective identity, okay? Potentially undermine Israel's efforts to maintain its own national identity and security. So I think we turn the focus there, and I think Munther Isaac weaponizes the Bible to bring about his own Palestinian nationalism, okay? Now, Munther embraces his own empire theology. Isaac is critical of the West and their perceived empire theology, prioritizing power and entitlement over justice and compassion. Now, here's where he argues that such a theology underpins imperial forces' actions, including those of the Israeli government, which marginalizes Palestine. And this is where the whole colonialism idea really surfaces in his theology. And here is where, unknowingly or knowingly, incorporates an Islamic idea on this, because it completely has the Islamic empire theology, okay, which began after Muhammad's death and was rooted in power and conquest. And so this is vital to understand this, particularly when you hear the West and all the evils they do. And if you ever take any classes in the humanities or the social sciences, or now it's spread through other departments, the idea you can draw all problems back to colonialism, okay? Progressive theology is all about colonialism, okay? It's a very simple-minded approach, but very popular among academics. And so Islamic empire's conquest were motivated by a religious duty to propagate Islam and institute Islamic law in these new acquired territories. And this, too, has an expansionist doctrine, okay? And it divides the world into two realms. Dar al-Islam, the realm of Islam, and Dar al-Arab, the realm of war, with the latter deemed necessary to bring about areas under Islamic government, okay? So this is the power ideology that undergirds Islam. And so oftentimes Islamic conquests were accompanied by military campaigns aimed at subjugating non-Muslim territories and integrating them into the expanding empires. The conquests, now, they were characterized by the establishment of Islamic government structures, the imposition of Islamic law, and the conversion or dimitude of non-Muslim populations. So, if Islam would come in and conquer a nation, non-Muslims had three choices. One, they can convert to Islam. 2, they would die by the sword. Or 3, they could serve as dhimmis, which meant that they were subservient to Islam and their control. And every year they had to have a reminder, and they were asked, do you agree to live under the jizya? And what they do, they'd have their heads bowed, and some of them, they would tap them on the neck to remember if they didn't live under subjection, then there would be consequences to that. So this is some of the ideas that were there that grew Islam. You can see where the imperial theology is very resonant. And so he completely ignores this. Either 1, he's ignorant, 2, he is maybe unknowingly deceptive, okay? But I think I must point that out. And so non-Muslims were subjected to social and economic and legal discrimination, and Islamic culture, religion privileged over indigenous traditions and beliefs, okay? Now, this suggests that the objection to Israel stems solely from military occupation. Okay, I don't think this is wrong. Their objection to Israel is their status as non-Muslims in a Jewish majority state or area. So the core objection to Israel's existence then, it reflects the Hamas charter and statements by the Palestinian Arab leaders, is the idea of Jews ruling over Muslims, why that should never be. Now, I also believe that it originates from a couple of fundamental concepts that require some examination here. Now, one is some of the stereotypes about the Jews. You find those in the Quran. In the Quran, you have, first of all, it's speaking very favorably of the Jews, but as Muhammad's ministry continues and the greater resistance from Jewish people, what you have is very negative and derogatory ideas because of their resistance to his message. The Christians seem to be more entertaining of it. The Jews were very resistant. So when you get the time at the end of the Revelations, you find a very different understanding of Jews and Christians in the Quran. Okay? What happens oftentimes is people will only look at verses in the Quran that were revealed earlier and say, look, there is rejection of other people's religions. Look, they did that. That's not true, because there's a principle called fitna that is really seen as potentially dangerous to the growth of the Islamic Empire because it brings unbelief. Okay, so that needs to be squelched. So that's very important to understanding these metals, or these ideas. Now, the historical context of dhimmitude, that means that they served as inferior. Now, you also have to understand, in the Islamic worldview, God, He will, those who surrender to Allah are the winners of history, both in this life and the life to come. In those who reject Allah, they are the losers of history in this life and the life to come. And so when you look at what happened after 1948, where Israel prospered, then what you see is this is highly problematic. And so they need to be subdued. They need to be have their power taken away from them, because they have no right to rule over us, or they don't have any right to be blessed and we're not. There's a cognitive dissonance that is happening here. And I think this is very, very important to understand. And so let's look at this, the role of dimitude. Now, this is when they expanded their powers over non-Muslim countries and non-Muslim populations. They forced them to pay the jizya, and this had definite inherent restrictions on their life, what they could do. Thinking about it now, they weren't full citizens. Now, when you look at immigration, I want to point this out real quick, that in immigration, when you look at the Jewish idea, how do you treat immigrants, that you should be kind to them, and so on, that is the idea that we're all created in the image of God, and everyone has essential dignity, so you're to treat immigrants with dignity and so on. But when that's not taught in the Quran, okay? As a matter of fact, the non-Muslims did not have essential dignity there. And so they were treated as such. So you have that idea. Fitna, I want to unpack a little bit. This is a word meaning trial, persecution, or temptation. But it's a helpful theological concept to understand because it holds a lot of theological importance on understanding Muhammad's transformation and the early Muslim community's experience. So following Muhammad's migration to Medina, he originally was in Mecca. Then they we'll say, kicked him out of Mecca. He goes to Medina, and there is where he began to accumulate his power and received a lot of the revelations of the Quran. And so this is where you find the verses that talk about fighting and so forth. Now, the clear emphasis, when you think about jihad and fighting, why was this? What is the overall purpose of this? It's to eliminate fitna. And that means unbelief. If you're going to have a power-advancing faith, you can't, unbelief, if you're going to advance a theocracy, unbelief is the enemy of that, okay? And so this is what you see there. So the Quran emphasizes fighting against those who persecute Muslims until there is no more fitna, okay? And so actually fitna became the foundational principle for justifying jihad or warfare in Islam. So from the Palestinian perspective, the presence of Israel in the region is often seen as a form of fitna. It represents not only a physical occupation of the land, but also a challenge to the Islamic identity and sovereignty of the Palestinian people. And this perception is rooted in different historical narratives, religious belief, and political grievances that frame the conflict as a struggle against oppression and injustice. And so what Munther Isaac does, he then intensifies this by giving it a Christian bumper sticker or a Christian justification. Now, Christian denominations in America, mainly progressive denominations, more specifically the Presbyterian Church USA, actually is promoting this teaching within this fellowship, which is highly problematic. So the process of the concept of fitna is used to justify various forms of resistance against Israel, including armed conflict, protests, diplomatic efforts to assert Palestinian rights, to regain control over the land, okay? And so what happens is Palestinians then view themselves as engaged in righteous struggle to overcome the fitna posed by Israeli occupation and establishing their sovereignty and independence. Again, what Isaac does, he accuses evangelical Christians to do that, but he never critiques the Palestinians. And this is why the oppressor model is so problematic and advances evil. The Muslim students, they know what's going on, or at least the people who are organizing this. Now the white progressive students who are lived in privilege and so on, who are really incredibly ignorant, doesn't have a clue, okay? They have this sort of idealized kind of thing. And so that's a bit of a long answer. This is another point I want to make, is that Munther Isaac supports an ideology that leads to ethnic cleansing that are highly problematic. Now, he's coming from the posture, we got to be prophetic, speaking against justice, and so on. And so that's where he's coming from. And so you use strong terminology to jar people into reality. But the problem is he's not examining these terms and what their effects will be. And it actually points to a greater problem, okay? So he uses terms like Nakba, genocide, religious apartheid, and Zionists. And these are very provocative and inflammatory, particularly with an Israeli and Palestinian context. And so these are not helpful. Matter of fact, they're not just unhelpful, that they lead to more evil being perpetuated because they're justifying hatred. So Palestinians are never accountable for their beliefs or for their actions. This is why you will see on college campuses the idea that in Palestine you are pro-Hamas. Hamas are the freedom fighters against this. Imagine that. Now remember what happened on October 7th, 2023. They not only killed them, but they raped corpses. They dismembered bodies. And that was the group that you're cheering on as heroes? Think of the pathological evil that is motivated by. So that's very, very, very important. So what happens in the portrayal of Israel as an oppressor contribute to the dehumanization of Israelis and justify violent or coercive measures aimed at resisting Israeli control. This is what happened at UCLA just this morning. It's what happened at Columbia University. It's what happened now that's fueling universities all over the United States by clueless, not just clueless white students and Islamic students or Muslim students, but faculty that are fueling this. And so to unravel this is going to take decades, but it shouldn't start now. Part of that is understanding what's going on here. Now, Munther Isaac promotes inequality and hypocrisy. His sort of application of liberation theology, he uses this as a framework to critique Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, this reveals a lot of elements of hypocrisy and perpetuates equality. Now, while he condemns Western powers, particularly the United States, for failing to hold Israel accountable for Palestinian violations, his approach appears selective, and he overlooks similar injustice, not just similar injustice, injustice that are not similar by Arab states that are much worse. So his bias undermines the credibility of his theological analysis. Like, for instance, the Palestinian Liberation Organization often portrays the conflict as a struggle against Western colonialism. framing Western powers as the primary oppressor of Palestinians. And so that's just one example of what this does. So I think this is important. Now, how do we respond to this? I'm going to go quickly here. First of all, selective application of theological principles. He appears to selectively apply the principles of Palestinian Liberation Theology, focus on the critique of Western powers like the U.S., and this selective application suggests a bias or a double standard in his theological analysis. So that is definitely a problem. His failure to address Arab responsibility, his perpetuation of inequality, and his hypocrisy in his critique, and his lack of solidarity to the oppressed, even Israel in a lot of ways, has really problematic consequences. Thank you.